Hello and welcome to Miniature Adventures. I'm Big Lee, and this week I want to talk about casualty recovery. So today's video was prompted by a discussion on a recent Wargame Soldiers and Strategy podcast. The guys were discussing various methods for working medics and casualty recovery into games. In many tabletop war games, the treatment of casualties is usually straightforward. A model is hit, if it fails its save and throw or resistance check, and it's removed from play. However, several rule sets have explored more nuanced approaches to representing battlefield medical care, casualty recovery, and the often chaotic process of dealing with the wounded. These mechanisms introduce an added layer of realism, narrative, and tactical choice to games, particularly in scenarios where the presence of medics or stretcher bearers can influence the outcome. So I thought I'd swing by a few examples. So in Bolt Action by Warlord Games, casualty recovery is represented in a simplified but tactically meaningful way. When an infantry model is wounded and would normally be removed from play, a nearby medic can intervene. If the medic is within 6 inches of an injured unit, roll of a 6 on a 6-sided dice prevents the casualty. It doesn't guarantee survival, but it does introduce the possibility that a model might continue to fight due to the timely arrival of a medical professional. Now, while the odds are low, the presence of a medic can psychologically influence player decisions and the placement of support units. Now, in this system, medics don't bring models back once removed, they just prevent removal at the moment of injury. This rule contributes to a grittier, more cautious tone in smaller skirmishes. By contrast, Infinity, the high-tech skirmish game by Corvus Belli, incorporates a much more robust and interactive system for casualty recovery. Models that suffer enough damage to be incapacitated do not necessarily die outright. Instead, they enter an unconscious state, remaining on the tabletop but unable to act. A doctor model may then attempt to revive them by moving into base contact and making a skill check based on the doctor's willpower stat. If successful, the model regains consciousness with a single wound restored and may return to play. However, if the roll fails, the model is removed permanently. Now, this mechanic not only creates high stakes moments, but also transforms battlefield rescue into a key tactical objective. Deciding when to risk your doctor under fire or whether to abandon a downed elite trooper adds significant drama to every encounter. Now, different approaches found in Warhammer 40,000 where field medics are often embedded in elite squads and come with unique abilities. Apothecaries in Space Marine forces, for example, can attempt to restore wounds to injured models or even return a slain model to the unit. Depending on the version of the rules and the faction codex in use, this may involve rolling a die, often a 4+ on a d6, to return a previously removed model to the table. Now, these heathen abilities tend to be faction specific, I really do hate that word faction, and thematically consistent, giving elite armies a gritty resilience and reinforcing the ideas of specialist roles within small units. While not every army has access to such abilities, those that do often make their medics a centrepiece of their force composition and their strategy. Now, in Chain of Command, by Two Fat Lardies, casualty recovery is woven into the broader system of morale and command degradation. When leaders are hit, they're not always killed instantly, but may be wounded, which limits their command effectiveness. A wounded junior leader, for instance, might be unable to issue as many orders, or might require assistance from another model. If a medic is present, they can stabilise the wounded leader, helping to prevent further morale penalties to nearby troops. Here, the rules do not emphasise the dramatic revival of frontline troops, but instead highlight the degrading effects of wounds on unit cohesion and command and control. This more granular approach suits the game's emphasis on battlefield friction and the importance of leadership. The Battlegroup system from Plastic Soldier Company takes yet another route, abstracting much of the battlefield recovery process through its morale system. Now, while individual medics are not modelled on the tabletop, the psychological and organisational effects of wounded soldiers are represented by the battle rating mechanic. As casualties accumulate, players draw random battle rating chits, simulating loss of cohesion, fatigue and fear. Some drawn counters may include events representing medics tending the wounded or encouraging a unit to rally, effectively acting as moments of reprieve rather than direct model recovery. Though abstract, these rules still recognise the battlefield medics' dimension, particularly the impact of survival and morale on the continuing effectiveness of a force. In Saga, particularly in its fantasy and historical variants like Age of Crusades and Age of Magic, some factions have abilities that simulate healing and recovery. These are not usually tied to dedicated medic models, but instead appear in the form of special abilities that can remove fatigue or even restore lost models. For instance, a cleric-like figure might call upon a divine power to bring back a fallen warrior or remove weariness from a tired unit. And while the mechanics are often framed as magical or spiritual in tone, they serve a similar purpose, extending the life of key models and offering the chance to recover from attrition. Now, across these varied systems, a common thread emerges. The presence of rules for casualty recovery and field medics brings not just additional complexity, but also added thematic depth and tactical nuance. These mechanisms tend to be most detailed in skirmish games, where the scale allows for individual figures to be tracked, states like wounded or unconscious to be managed, and recovery actions to play out in meaningful ways. In these contexts, every figure matters, and the fate of a single wounded trooper can shift the battle's momentum. And of course, this raises a broader question. Are these kinds of casualty recovery mechanisms only suitable for skirmish scale games, or could they be adapted to larger battles involving hundreds of figures? Now, on one hand, the administrative burden of tracking wounded states and managing individual recoveries in a brigade or division level game would be absolutely excessive, potentially bogging down any gameplay. On the other hand, abstracted versions of these rules, as seen in Battlegroup, demonstrate that the concept can be scaled up to some extent. Rather than modelling each medic or each wounded soldier, a rule set might incorporate morale recovery and reinforcement rules that simulate the impact of battlefield medicine on force cohesion and stamina. Doing so would maintain the flavour and narrative richness of medical recovery without overwhelming the player with lots of details. Ultimately, the inclusion of medics and casualty recovery adds a valuable human element to wargames. It reminds players that battles are not just about firepower and manoeuvre, but also about survival, resilience, and the will to keep fighting. Whether in the tense alleyways of a modern skirmish or the sweeping fields of a grand historical clash, the act of saving the wounded can be as decisive and as dramatic as delivering the killing blow. So all of this, of course, begs the question, do you like to see casualty recovery mechanics in a rule set? And if you do, what is your favourite example? What's your favourite rule set for this? Or do you think that this is just slows down the game and detracts from the tactical challenge of the scenario? As always, I would love to hear what you think in the comments below. So we've got time for a hobby update, and last weekend my group, Postage Rejects, finally got back together for a proper game in the Shed of War. It's been a little while. Over the summer the shed has been used as, well, actually a shed while Ray moved house. So this was our first chance in months to actually get back in the shed, roll some dice and get a big game in. Stuart, the Postie and Postage Rejects, hosted the game as usual and brought out a massive Napoleonic battle. Set in the summer of 1812 during the French advance into Russia, he used his brilliant 15mm collection with the General de Brigade rules, and the game lasted a solid 6 hours of gameplay. Now, before I dive into the action, I should mention that I've already put out a short video showing some of the highlights from the game. So if you want to see the table, the armies and a few dramatic moments, go check out that video after you've listened to this. Now, for this particular battle we had 4 players, and as usual sides were decided at random. I ended up teamed up with Ray, who was leading the French. Facing us across the table were Mark and Steve, commanding the Russians. So before anything began, we had to roll to see who would deploy first, and unfortunately, as a French player, we had to set up first before the Russians. So, not knowing how the Russians were going to deploy, Ray and I went for a flexible plan. We kept our cavalry in reserve in the centre, ready to move to either flank if needed, and our main force was pretty straightforward. Skirmishers out in front, attack columns behind them, and what little artillery we had pushing forward where it could to do the most good. The Russians, on the other hand, spread their troops evenly across the whole front. They had their own line of skirmishers out ahead, but they gave nothing away about their real intentions. Now, as the battle began, both sides advanced, and it quickly became clear that nobody was playing a defensive game here. This was going to be a bloody fight from the very beginning. My brigade spent most of the game contesting a hill on the French left flank, gradually edging towards the centre with some of my brigades so that I could support Ray. And Ray had the tougher task though. His columns were facing a Russian artillery battery with infantry lined up in front of them. One big advantage we had was troop quality. Many of our units were elite while most of the Russians were standard line infantry, and that did make a bit of a difference in the long run. Now the fighting grew very fierce very quickly. By lunchtime, casualties were piling up on both sides. The Russians were definitely suffering more, but the game still felt very balanced, and at no point could we be certain of victory. By the late stages, the battlefield was absolute chaos. Regiments were shattered, some had fled the table entirely, flags had fallen, commanders were being cut down. Ray had managed to break through parts of the Russian line and cause some serious disruption to Steve's command, but even then it still felt way too close to call. When we finally wrapped things up, Stuart worked out the scores: Canton casualties, broken commands, lost standards and fallen leaders, and the result? The French won, but only by the narrowest of margins. Just 2 points separated the sides. So after 6 hours of intense play and our first face-to-face game in months, Ray and I were delighted, frankly. It may have been a close call, but a win is still a win. So that's it for this week. As always, please join the conversation in the comments below. I really do enjoy reading your comments, and I try to respond to as many as I can. And of course, if you enjoyed the video, please like, subscribe and share, and consider channel membership for extra perks and members only videos. So until next week, stay safe, keep gaming, and of course, keep rolling high.